Okay, does everyone hear me properly? Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about a three-dimensional dust map that I've been working on with Doug Finkbeiner, Eddie Schlafly, and our basic problem is that we have a lot of photometric data, and we'd like to, we have photometry from about 1 billion stars, and we'd like to infer where the dust is in 3 dimensions in the Milky Way. So our data is pan-stars, which has done a GRIZY photometric survey of 3/4 of the sky, everything down to Dec -30. And we have, in addition, the 2-micron all-sky survey, which has JHKS photometry and is full sky. So we take the overlap of those two regions, which is, again, 3/4 of the sky, and we have potentially 8-band photometry spanning the entire visible and then the near infrared. So that comes to about 800 million stars with high-quality multi-band photometry. And so our problem is that imagine we have ourselves. Let's see this. Okay, we have ourselves here, and we're surrounded by stars. And those stars all have different reddenings, different cumulative reddenings from our point of view. But if we split up the sky into just different lines of sight, we'd like to trace the reddening as it increases along one line of sight, and then we do that along every line of sight, and we have a 3-dimensional map. The problem is, though, that you can't just see the reddening of a star, especially when you only have photometry. You would like to see the reddening of every star, but then every star has intrinsic colors. So stars that are farther away on average look redder, but some of the stars look blue just because they're intrinsically bluer. And some of the stars close by look red just because they're intrinsically redder. So you have some combination of internal stellar type and reddening that gives the color of the star. So you actually have to treat this as some sort of forward modeling problem where you're trying to model at the same time the type of the star, the distance, and the reddening. So we begin by splitting the sky up into lines of sight with approximately constant number of stars. So you can see that some places where there's lower stellar density, we have larger pixels, and some places we've subdivided the pixels further because we have higher stellar density. This is just sort of a heuristic subdivision that we do before we even begin the problem, and then we're going to solve the problem within each pixel independently. So inside each pixel, we're going to try to come up with a model of the type of every one of these stars and the reddenings. And we're going to make the assumption that allows us to solve this problem that a star in one pixel, which is farther away, will be behind a greater column of dust than a star that's closer by. So every star within the pixel is somehow linked by this consistency prior. So from a forward modeling perspective, I'm just going to show you, assuming that we knew everything about all the stars, we knew their distances, types, and everything, how do we predict their data? So I'm going to show this on a plot which has distance modulus, which is sort of a logarithmic scale of distance, and the reddening. So the first thing that we need is we need to know how the reddening is increasing with distance. And again, we're just assuming that we know this, and then we're going to infer all these things later based on the data. So we have some curve of how reddening increases with distance, and we're going to parameterize that by the increase in reddening in every distance bin. So you can see it's a stepwise or piecewise linear function. Then we're going to give a distance to every star, distance modulus for every star, and that means that every star is now somewhere along this reddening curve. So every star now has a distance and a reddening. And we're going to actually relax the prior that every star is exactly along the same column of dust a little bit, because there is some variation within the pixel of how the reddening behaves. The reddening might actually be slightly less in one direction or slightly more in one direction. So we're going to allow each star to be somewhat offset from the from the mean line of sight reddening in the pixel. And finally, we're going to give a type to every star. So this is the intrinsic type or the intrinsic colors of the star. So once we have those things, we can predict what the magnitudes are, because now we have a reddening and a distance and a type for every star, so we can just predict what the magnitude should be in our photometric system. And by comparing that with by comparing this predicted magnitudes with the actual magnitudes, we get a likelihood. And then we have priors on how the dust increases with the line of sight, the distance of the stars, the types of the stars, and we have a prior that there's some amount of variation within the pixel which limits this delta, how far each star can be from the mean reddening in the pixel. So you can view every star as essentially putting some sort of constraint based on its photometry on where in distance reddening space the star can lie. If you marginalize over all the type that the star can have, and you look at the colors, you get some constraint on distance and reddening. And so however these parameters work out, the distance and reddening to each star has to sort of fall within some cloud that's unique, or that's particular to that star. So you can see how each star is some sort of spring, essentially, that is constraining how this line of sight can vary. But this is actually a large number of parameters to sample. So we would like to somehow, if we have, say, a couple hundred stars in a pixel, then we have two parameters describing stellar type. We have the offset from the line of sight reddening. We have the distance of the star. So that could be potentially, say, 400 stars, 400 parameters. And then we have a couple dozen parameters for the line of sight reddening. So we're talking about a couple hundred parameters in the line of sight, and we'd like to somehow factorize the problem so that we solve a set of smaller problems and then combine them for the line of sight. So what we do actually is that we, before we do this sampling, we marginalize over the stellar types. And that gives us actually this constraint that we had on the distance and the reddening that the star can lie in actually expands because we're marginalizing over the type of the star and also over its offset. And then we sample one problem for each star individually, and then we go back and we sample for the line of sight. And this ends up being, we show in our paper that it's actually mathematically equivalent. So what this ends up looking like is that we have, for every star we've sampled, some sort of surface in distance and reddening this is for 4 different stars, but we do this for every star along the line of sight, of given the star's photometry, where it could lie. And then we're essentially finding curves that are consistent with all the stars. So in this example, all the stars are consistent with the same curve of how distance could increase with reddening. And you see some stars are putting very strong constraints on the line of sight reddening, and some stars put very weak constraints on the line of sight reddening. And that's just based on if it's how aligned the reddening vector is with the stellar locus, what type of star we have, and so on. And yes, we do this with hundreds of stars in one sight line, and we get something that looks like this. This is just sort of a representation of what's going on in one pixel. It's not actually anything this isn't something that we actually use in the fitting, but it just shows you what's going on. We've taken all those probability densities for every star of what distance modulus and what reddening they could be at, and we've just stacked them so you can see what's going on. And you see that nearby the stars in this pixel have low reddening, and far away they have to have large reddening. So there's some jump in reddening at this distance. So we end up doing this for about 2.4 million pixels in the sky. And we end up getting something that looks like this. This is going to be as we increase in, this is the 3 pi star radians of the sky, and this is as we increase in distance. And you can see that the Orion Nebula appears before, say, the plane of the galaxy. And in every, you might notice there's a little bit of speckling here, a little bit of noise in the movie. That's because we've sampled for every pixel, so we have different possibilities of how the reddening could increase with distance for every pixel. And so in every frame of this movie, we're choosing a different random sample. So early on in the movie, which is nearby, you can see that we're very uncertain about some of the nearby clouds, whether they're there or not, and so those have a lot of noise, and then they become less noisy as we become certain that the cloud is there. So you can see in the end we've traced a lot of structures in the Milky Way. We have the plane of the Milky Way. Note that this is the longitude equals 0 line is here. I've just shifted the longitude so that the Dec minus 30 hole is not in the center of the map. And so we have the plane of the Milky Way, we have the Aquila Rift, we have Orion, Perseus, Taurus. We're actually seeing, all these structures that we know are real, so it's a good thing to see. I'll show you a nearby or a closer up region. This is going to be Perseus and Taurus, and then Orion is appearing. And then farther away, the more distant clouds in the plane of the galaxy. And it is nice to see that even though we fit every single pixel independently here, that we do have features that are appearing over a wide range of distances. They're all appearing in neighboring pixels together. Even that didn't have to happen. If something were wrong, that wouldn't happen, because there's nothing connecting, so a pixel here and a pixel, at this position plus epsilon. One more thing I wanted to show you in this particular region, which is interesting, is if you take a look at what will happen here with Orion, you'll notice that first, actually, Orion appears to be a ring or a bubble-like shape before the more distant features appear in the plane of the galaxy. And that's something that actually Eddie Schlafly found in the map and published on. And it's interesting to see whether or not there could be some sort of ancient supernova that happened there, which, as the shell of the supernova swept up material, whether it formed the famous Orion clouds, but also this edge of the bubble, which you can see when it's deprojected, or whether there was some sort of strong stellar winds. But we weren't able to determine exactly what the origin of this bubble shape is, but it is interesting to see that, that it is a bubble. So because we have a three-dimensional map, we can also just do some three-dimensional volume renderings and say what would it look like if we were in some sort of spaceship moving around the galaxy. These are the funner pictures, I think, of the map. So here we're just moving about 150 parsecs from the sun and moving around a little bit, looking towards the anticenter. And again, you see Orion, California Cloud, Taurus, Perseus. And here we'll just do a loop around the sun in order to see the parallax shift. So you can see all these nearby clouds, how they shift more than the farther away clouds. So that's all fun, but we like to know that it's actually also that's quantitatively correct. So we're going to do some comparisons with two-dimensional maps. Here's our map when we project it to 2 dimensions. So we just take the integrated map and we stretch it very hard so we can see the very small features. And now here's what happens when we subtract off the SFD map on the same scale. So you see that most of the high latitude features go away. There are still, obviously, residuals in the plane of the galaxy. We don't see through all the dust in the galaxy because we don't have stars that are on the opposite side of the galaxy that we can see photometrically. There's too much reddening. And if we can't see stars behind the dust, we can't trace the dust in our map. So the mission-based maps should see more dust in the plane of the galaxy. There are also some things that you can see that are, I think, artifacts in the SFD map. You can see, for example, some of the clouds have sort of halos around them, and that has to do with the temperature map in SFD being much lower resolution than the IRAS map was. And some of those halos go away when we compare with the Planck optical depth-based map. There are still some features which may be due to changes in the ratio of emission to absorption and scattering of the dust in different parts of the sky. So in some places we have, in general, more dust in our map, more dust in our map here and less dust over here. And that may be due to the reddening vector changing slightly. And in our work so far, we have only considered a constant reddening vector, which is, of course, a very large approximation to make. So just to show a closer up region, this is Aquila South, and this is in SFD, and then in our map. And they nominally have the same resolution, but because of the temperature map of SFD being only about 1 degree on a 1 degree scale, some of these very fine Photometry features get spread out. So you can see that especially here. So here's then the difference between the two maps. And if I stretch it more, so you can see a lot of the Photometry features are much sharper in our map than they are in SFD. So our next steps for improving this map are first something that we're doing right now, which is to go to the southern hemisphere. This is DECAM, where we were just, I just got back from, and we were trying to observe the southern plane of the Milky Way. Everything between L of about 245 and 360 is unobservable from Hawaii. So we'd like to fill in essentially a 10-degree strip of the plane of the Milky Way that we're fairly certain DES is not going to want to look at. And then we'll take later DES data and all the data that various people are collecting with the dark energy camera, and we'll incorporate that into the map to extend it to the southern hemisphere. It's nice to use DCAM because it observes in a very similar filter set to pan-stars, so all the work translates very well to it. We also want to include additional data sets, especially in the infrared. When you go into the infrared, you have less dust. You see farther through the dust. You can also get more of a lever on the reddening law. So we think that Spitzer glimpse and the UKIDS galactic plane survey will be very helpful. UKIDS, like pan-stars, is only the north, but glimpse covers the entire galactic plane. And looking forward to the future, it's not going to be too long before Gaia starts releasing parallaxes and spectrophotometry. The parallaxes, of course, will be very useful in getting a very strict distance prior on the distances to a large number of stars. So that will really help to tie down certain distance scales in the map. And the spectrophotometry will just be like having a lot of photometric bands for some number of stars. And of course, eventually, LSST will give us an insane amount of photometry that's very deep in a similar set of bands to do this problem on. There are also some improvements we can make to our method. So if you recall, we fit the line of sight in every single pixel, in every single line of sight independently. We don't have any sort of prior that if you look in one place in the sky that the dust, 1 arc minute away from it is very highly correlated with the line of sight you're looking at. So especially in nearby distance slices of the map, you can see a lot of noise where most of the pixels think that there's some sort of, say, dust cloud here, but some of the pixels just don't have, for whatever reason, a star that's in front of the cloud and behind the cloud. So we haven't bracketed the distance of the cloud as well, and we don't know, say, in this pixel that there's a cloud there. But given the fact that all the other pixels around it are saying there's a cloud, it's very likely that this pixel looks similar to the pixels around it. So this would be helped probably by having some sort of dust power spectrum that we assumed. Now this problem goes. Oh yeah, I would just like to say like this map doesn't look a priori likely. This is not what I expect dust to look like. If you take out the noise, like the 0 pixels, I would expect it to look like dust. And the problem goes away if we go to larger distances. Eventually, most of the pixels then realize that there's dust there, but we'd like it to put all the dust at consistent distances. So we can do that by insubing a power spectrum for the dust, and this would couple reddenings of different stars that are farther away in the sky. And one nice thing you can do with this is that you can really start shrinking your pixels if you do this, because right now we have to have and not large enough pixels that we have enough stars in the pixel to constrain the line of sight the dust column. We want to have a whole number of stars along the line of sight that are tracing the reddening. But if we actually allow there to be correlations between the reddening in different lines of sight, we can just shrink down the pixels essentially to 1 star per pixel. And then the stars are still sharing information, but they're sharing them actually in a more principled manner because you're sharing them based on something that you know about the power spectrum of the dust. So that's a more principled way to go. It's also you're coupling a larger part of the sky, and so you have to solve more parameters simultaneously. So it's a somewhat more difficult problem computationally. So finally, I'd just like to say that we have a website for this project. You can look at our results that we have so far. You can do things like the website is argonaut.skymaps.info. And you can just type in like a longitude and a latitude. And it'll give you some information about the line of sight reddening. And it'll give you just some pictures of what the dust looks like in that direction. You can download the results. We also have, you can download the entire map if you want. Or you can just query the map. We have some way that you can tie this all into your own code. We wrote a function that essentially you just put this in your code, and as long as you have an internet connection and you call this function, it will just ask our server for the line of sight reddening in some direction. And we also show you here how to use the actual data cube if you wanted to download the data cube. Here's some examples of how you can plot various things using the data cube. Okay, that's it.
One of your first slides where you plotted the reddening versus distance, you showed examples, I think it was 4 stars and their probability distributions.
Yeah.
And I was struck by how narrow the range was in distance for the stars. So is there some like restricted prior you used or some information that was added in, like were all the stars assumed to be giants? Or how did you get such a small range of probability for distances?
Yeah, I think that those stars which have very tight distances but very uncertain reddenings, I think that what's happening is that you're in a part of parameter space where the reddening vector is essentially parallel with the stellar locus in color space, and so as you increase reddening, you're making the star fainter, and you're also changing the color in the correct way. And so there's just the interplay of how stars get brighter in one direction of the stellar locus, and it's just that you can essentially in some parts of parameter space, I guess the simplest thing to say is that reddening is very degenerate with distance, is very degenerate with stellar type, but you almost don't change distance as you're moving along the stellar locus. That's just, but it really depends on the type of star that you're looking at, and yeah, you just have to look at the intersection and how the magnitude is changing across the stellar locus, and how if that's similar to the magnitude change that you get from just the reddening itself.
So there are other stars that would show such a narrow.
Yeah, there are other stars which actually the typical star is not so well constrained in distance, but is actually much better constrained in reddening. So I think that this is what you're talking about. Yeah, the typical star is actually better constrained in distance than, in reddening than in distance than this. Yeah, these are not necessarily representative.
Do you get any, or have you looked for any information on clumpiness of the dust from your results?
Yeah, well, we haven't we haven't looked at the power spectrum of the dust that we have. Just qualitatively, it looks very much like, like the two-dimensional, well, quantitatively as well, it looks like the two-dimensional maps. So I think that we'll get very similar results. In the distance direction, we can't really get a very good power spectrum because our distance is so uncertain compared to transverse direction in the map.
So that, you know, the deviations from your average.
Oh, yeah. I'm not actually sure. That'd be interesting to look at. I'm not sure how. I haven't really looked carefully at how much the stars want to deviate from the mean line of sight reddening.
What is the highest reddening value you find, and do you restrict EB minus V to be greater than 0?
We restrict it to be greater than 0. And we go up essentially to, well, there's a limit in EB minus V and distance that we can reach. That's dependent on our survey depth. So the survey depth is about 21st, 22nd magnitude. And so at a given distance, the distance plus the total extinction has to be less than that, plus the intrinsic luminosity of the star. So we probably go to an EB minus V only a few magnitudes before we start really running out of stars.
Let's thank Greg again.
Let me turn the lights back.
It's okay.
Is that the... Okay. Okay. Okay, hi, thanks everyone for being here. So I'm David Jones, I'm in the stats department, and I'm going to talk about disentangling overlapping astronomical sources using spatial and spectral information. So this is joint work with Renee, who may be here, and David Van Dyke, who's at Imperial College. Okay, so our data comes from the Chandra and XMM telescopes, and it consists of the spatial coordinates of photons detected, and also the energy of the photons detected, or the PI channel. So of course, because of telescope response, a point source doesn't look like a point as on the left, but rather it's spread out as on the right. So in particular, the photons are probabilistically spread out according to the point spread function. So here's an example image from Chandra at the bottom left, and I'll show an analysis for this later. As we can see, when two sources are close together, their PSFs overlap, and then we can't tell which source each photon comes from. Okay, and in some cases, we may not even be able to tell how many sources there are. So the aim is to infer the number of sources, their intensities, their positions, and their spectral distributions. So the standard way of doing this is to draw circles around the likely positions of the sources, and then base the analysis on those source regions. But that kind of ignores quite a lot of the uncertainties involved. So instead, what we do is we propose a full Bayesian model for the data, and then we infer the posterior we calculate the posterior distribution for all the parameters, including the number of sources, so we can coherently quantify uncertainties. And we additionally include a model for the spectral information. So this gives us extra precision in separating sources. So this is just, in the bottom right, this is just a quick preview of our algorithm. So this is an XMM observation, and this is a single iteration of our algorithm where we have probabilistically assigned every single photon to one of the two sources or the background. And in the next iteration, every photon will again be assigned to the sources. So over many iterations, we can get a picture of the likely origin of each photon. Okay, so I mentioned we have a Bayesian model. So that's kind of the key part of our method. So I'm going to kind of talk through it briefly. So it's a Bayesian data generating model, which means that basically one way we can describe the model is to imagine that the data were actually generated by the model. So forward modeling in Greg's talk. So of course, in practice, what happens is we have an image, and then we go backwards. We infer the parameters. Okay? So let's begin with the spatial data. What will eventually be observed is n, which is the total number of photons, and the spatial coordinates of photon I. So, but if we were going to generate the data, what would we do? Well, the first thing is we need the number of sources, k. Here's some sources, and we assume this comes from we put a Poisson prior on the number of sources with mean kappa. Okay, and I'll show in a little bit that actually our analysis is not very sensitive to this prior. Okay, so now we have these sources. We need their relative brightnesses. So I'm not going to talk through all the specific priors, but here we can see that source 1 is much brighter than source 2, and we've also included a background intensity. So then we have these intensities, and then we need to probabilistically assign photons to each. So the brightest source has many photons, and the source that's not as bright has fewer photons. And so again, going in this forward modeling approach, we now need the positions of the sources. So our prior is just that we assume they're uniformly spread over the image, because obviously we don't know where they are before we observe the image. And then once we have the sources, we can spread the photons out around the sources according to the PSF, or in the case of the background, just uniformly across the whole image. Okay, so as I said, what will happen in practice is we'll get an image essentially like this, and then infer all the parameters that we have seen, the posterior distributions. Okay, so this is the spatial data. Let's quickly look at the spectral data model. So for each photon, we observe EI, which is the PI channel of the photon. And for a given source, we assume that the spectral distribution is just a gamma distribution. So here's an example. It's just a very simple distribution. Okay. So here, we're just modeling the very basic shape of the spectral distribution. We're not including the RMF or the RF or anything. Okay. So it's just a very basic gamma distribution, and it has two parameters, alpha and beta. And we have priors for those, but I haven't written it here. So there are k sources, so there are k different gamma distributions. And there's also the background. And we assume that the general spectral shape of the background is just a uniform, so it's more diffuse than the sources. So the point is we're only modeling the very basic shape of the spectral distributions, but that's still enough to help us separate sources. Okay, and we don't want to make the model too complicated. So, so how do we? Once we have an image, the next step is to calculate the posterior distributions for all the parameters. And the way we do that is by using an algorithm, an reversible jump Monte Carlo Markov chain algorithm. So I'm not going to talk through this algorithm. It's kind of long-winded, but an important thing to mention is that the kind of model I've described and the algorithm is it's known that they can be very sensitive to the prior on the number of components or sources in this case. But actually, that doesn't happen here. And the reason for that is that we're assuming that the PSF is just completely known. So the shape of the PSF. So the problem is well constrained because we're essentially just moving the PSF around the image until we find clusters of points that look like the PSF. So it's well constrained. So here's an example. We simulated 20 datasets, each with 10 sources. And then we found the mean posterior distribution for the number of sources k over the 20 datasets. So, and we did that under two settings. On the left here, the prior mean number of sources was 10. And on the right, the prior mean number of sources was 1. And we see that in both cases, we pick out, on average, the correct number of sources, which is 10. We can say that these two distributions are different, which they obviously are a bit. But we should bear in mind that on the left, the prior probability for there being 10 sources is about 1.25 million times larger than on the right. So that's a huge difference in the prior, but the posterior hasn't changed that much. Okay, so I want to talk about some simulation studies to kind of illustrate the method, and in particular I want to illustrate why the spectral information is useful. So this is an example simulated data set. There's actually two sources here that are very close together. I'm going to talk through the particular settings in a moment. But for each kind of setup, we simulate 100 data sets, and then we analyze them once using only the spatial part of our model, and then again using the whole model that includes the spectral data. Okay, so in our simulations and our real data analysis, we use the King density as the PSF. So this is just essentially a 2D Cauchy distribution shown here. And to interpret our simulation settings, we define a source region. And we define that to be the region where the PSF is greater than 10% of its maximum. So that's just this green circle. It's just the circle of radius 1, basically. So it's very easy to remember. Okay, so let's look at the simulation settings. In each simulation, we're just going to keep it very simple, just have two sources. And one of the settings is their separation. Okay, so this is the smallest separation. So they're very close together. The circles are the source regions that I just defined. And these are very close together, and then as they get further apart, they will be easier to separate. Okay. Next, we have the relative brightness of the sources. So N1 is the number of counts from the bright source, and that's drawn from a Poisson distribution with mean 1,000 counts. The fainter source has mean 1,000 over R counts. So R is the relative intensity. So here, the faint source is extremely faint. You can hardly see it, right? But as we increase, as we go through the settings, it becomes brighter and then easier to detect. So the last setting is the background. So N0 is the number of counts from the background, number of photons. And that comes from a Poisson distribution. And the way we set that is we set it based on how many photons we expect to fall in the faint source region. So here's the faint source region. And in this very strong background setting, the expected number of counts from the background is the same as the expected number of counts from the faint source in the faint source region. So that's very strong background relative to the source. And then there's other settings. But we actually concentrate on this strongest setting because that's the hardest case, and that's where the spectral information is useful. So lastly, we need the spectral information. So as I said, we have gamma distributions in our spectral model. So we just also simulate from gamma distributions. The red is the one we use for the bright source, and the dashed blue line is for the faint source. And these are actually essentially spectral shapes that we inferred from an XMM observation, so they should be somewhat realistic. Okay, so here's some results. So this is for the spatial only model. Okay, so we're not using the spectral information. Each panel, so here's a panel, each panel corresponds to one simulation setting. The big crosses correspond to the true locations of the sources. And as we go from left to right, you see that the sources get further apart. Okay? As we go from top to bottom, then the faint source gets brighter, so it's easier to detect. So in each panel, there's lots of little dots. Okay? So each dot corresponds to a different data set. And what the dots show are the posterior estimates of the source positions. So you'll see that the red dots are basically always on the red cross. And that's because the red is for the bright source, which is always can be found. But the blue dots, if we look in this top left panel, are all over the place. And that's because the faint source is very faint here. And the sources are close together, so we can't find the faint source. But as we go towards the bottom right, the sources get further apart, and the faint source gets brighter, so that we pick up both sources. So one other thing I want to point out in these results is that the size of the little points correspond to the posterior probability of there being two sources. So if the point is very small, they'll probably just be all over the place, because that means there's very little evidence in the data for there being two sources anyway, so probably can't find the position. So now I want to draw your attention to this panel, with the green circle. So here the two sources are close together, and the faint source is intermediate brightness. But we see that we're not really picking up the correct position of the faint source. The blue dots are all over again. So now let's introduce the spectral information. So we have additional information. So now we can see here that we're picking up the correct position of the faint source much better. And also the little points are bigger, which means that there's more evidence for there being two sources. Okay, so if I flick through it again, you'll see that in many of the other panels, we're also doing better. So this is the spatial only model, and this is the full model. Okay, so that's the simulations. And let me just finish with two data analyses. So very briefly, first of all, we analyzed an XMM observation of a binary source, FK and FL-AQR. And these sources, in previous analyses, it's been very difficult to separate their spectral distributions. But when we plot the posterior distributions for the shape parameters of the spectral distribution, we find that the posteriors are actually quite well separated. So this, although the difference is very small between the parameters. So this shows that by carefully accounting for the origins of the photons, we can get more precision and at least separate the basic shape. Okay, so next we analyzed the Chandra image. This is the one I showed you at the beginning. And we actually only analyzed the top right corner because this source is very distorted. Okay, so here's some results. On the left, the spatial only model, and then the full model. This includes the spectral information. So the blue regions show the 90% posterior regions for the source locations. And actually both models in this case find 14 sources. And the regions are slightly smaller when we use the full model, but you can't really see that here. So anyway, this is the hardest source to pick up. There's kind of contamination from this source and so on. And it's faint. And this box contains two very closely overlapping sources, and we do a follow-up spectral analysis, which I'll show you briefly in a second. So first, I'll just mention that these are the posterior distributions for the number of sources. So as I said, that both models pick up 14 sources. The spatial only model has a bit more evidence for 15 sources. But when we investigated those, we found that they were just randomly spread over. So there's no specific location that seems to have a 15th source. And the full model basically puts a higher criterion on calling a cluster of points a new source, because it has to have a reasonable spectral shape as well. So we kind of rule out the 15th source. So this is the follow-up analysis I mentioned of those two sources that are overlapping. So as I said, we just model the very basic spectral shape in our model, in our algorithm. So, but that may not be enough, right, in many astronomy applications. So, but what we do is we have probabilistically assigned every single photon in each iteration of our algorithm. So, given such allocation of the photons, we can then run Sherpa and do a better model, right? And in the next iteration of our algorithm, we assign all the photons all over again. And then we can run Sherpa again, and then we get another fit. And then, So if we do that many, many times, we get a histogram of fits. So I've just shown two parameters here, the absorption column and the flux for the bright and the faint source. And so the spread shows the uncertainty in those parameters due to the uncertainty about the photon allocations. Now the red line shows the fit when you use the standard method, which just draws circles around the sources. And the dashed line is a confidence interval. So we can see that's kind of quite off in many cases. And that's because it's not accounting for contamination very well. Both these two sources and also other sources in the image. So just mention a few extensions. So we're hoping to build in spatially varying PSFs and perhaps PSF uncertainty. And also we want to scale it to work for larger images. So one way of doing that is to cut up the image. So if we have clusters, two groups of sources that are not overlapping at all, we can just cut them out and analyze them in parallel. Okay, and there's graphical, there's some methods that already exist to do that. And there's some other things. So one is to build in temporal data. Okay, so actually, next year I'll be at SAMSI doing an astrostat postdoc. So I'll probably work on some of these and then update the code that we have online as well. Okay, so thanks very much for listening.
All right, questions?
Yeah.
How long does it take to run your reverse Woodchuck MCF?
A long time. Like a day, on the order of a day. Yeah.
For one field.
Yeah.
On what kind of computer?
On the cluster. So, but it's just I'm not doing things in parallel. So it's definitely not optimal, but the speed, but it is definitely very slow as well.
I just want to find out the running time depends on number of photons.
Oh yeah.
So, I think the estimate of the day depends on like how many 14,000 or 10,000.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and in the XMM data there were a lot more photons, so it took a lot longer.
So what is actually the output of this then? Is it
So.
each of 14 sources, samples from change for position, flux and stuff, or is it an ensemble of catalogs?
So one thing we want is for each parameter, such as the number of sources or the spectral parameters, we want these posterior distributions. So that tells us the uncertainty about the parameters. That's one thing we want. The other thing we want is that each iteration of our photon assigns each iteration of our algorithm assigns all the photons. So we have many assignments of the photons, and that kind of gives us an overall distribution of the possible assignments, the likely assignments. And so,
I'm just wondering because your fluxes and positions for our nearby sources will be highly covariant, and I'm just wondering how you encode that covariance in your outputs.
so because when we did this final analysis, then we base each fit here on a allocation of all the photons. So obviously, if one photon is assigned to one source, it can't be assigned to the other source. So that kind of builds in. Is that? Okay.
Have you compared your results to other point source detection algorithms like wave detect or source extractor?
No, not extensively. No, not probably. No.
Just to follow up on that. Implicitly, yes, because this analysis of the RAN of the group dataset, we compared it to the group catalog, which is based on data. And most of the sources here were also detected in group, except the faint source is not in group.
Yeah, one last question, and then we can continue the discussion over pizza.
The PSF itself changes as a function of photon energy, right?
Yes.
So when you're passing through a PSF function in order to see what is a source, you actually have to do it in different energy ranges and use different PSS, and then you can go back and stack them up.
So we haven't varied the PSF at this stage. We've just fixed the PSF.
Okay, so you're taking all your spectral information strictly from some other source where you've got a spectrum from, rather than just using the data in hand. Because if you take the energy range, say 2 to 4 keV, you have a certain PSF that you can run through to select out sources. And then you take the energy range, 4 to 6, you'll have a different PSF, because the PSF itself is a function of energy, isn't that correct? Yes.
I mean, can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
No, it's just that, yes, you're absolutely right. But, it's just that we haven't gotten around to creating the PSF. The PSF right now, I think we're just using we haven't figured out exactly how to deal with uncertainty in PSF or misclassification of the PSF. But one thing that we discovered was this process is not that sensitive to small changes in the PSF. So whether you use, let's say, PSF that's at 1.5 keV or something, or 3 keV, it doesn't seem to matter that much.
Let's thank Dave again. Please help yourself to pizza.
Yeah, and all the times I go on scanning fields in East Boston.
It shades like a liquid plane. Yes. But I'm pretty sure that you are one of those. Yeah. I've never seen it in like a real stuff. It's always been like a Chinese story.
Good morning.
But yeah, obviously those
So I am thankful like a certain top three. And then interpolate it over time. I will sure I don't know which one. Yes, I know it sounds really good.
Like you're integrating each of the directions.
To another, yeah.
Yes, you can pick very similar.
It's not like part of like.
I think all of the data I use to, for instance, part of with coordination, essentially basically what we would do is I think they've been their questions, and then corresponding analysis.
So one thing that happens, you have a source that is very hard. And you're using this more of the scatter is going to go off. So you get
So that's like
you're not running out. So yeah, you do a bias. As long as you know what the selection means.
I think so this is not back for bots.
There was a citation, that citation does not exist in ES or anywhere.
What about in that?
And so I have to learn to say
That's probably. The 15th source. The 15th source. It's easy to find. There are 14